How are we going to know God any better through this story? And how are we going to learn to be those who will be more faithful and glorify God from this story? And not repeat being Nebuchadnezzar's ourselves. So this morning, we are going to continue our journey in the book of Daniel. We are going to look at chapters 4 and 5 today. Chapters 4 and 5. And there is a particular question I want you all to think about. Question is, which is the greater challenge to faithfulness, adversity or prosperity? Today we're going to look at the contrast between these two and see if you draw any conclusions from our story. Before we do, though, let's ask the Lord for his assistance in helping us to hear him and understand that which he wants to teach us. Father in heaven, once again, it is a great privilege to be blessed by your intentionality for us to be able to hear from you as you reveal yourself to us, that we can know you more perfectly, more completely, and more intimately as we abide in you faithfully. And we can better understand your design for our life in no matter what circumstances you have providentially placed us in. Whether we are in abundance or in want, adversity or prosperity, Lord, we pray that this would be a time when we would hear from you. And you would help us to understand, maybe not so much as to why you've placed us in the conditions that we're in, but what it is that you want us to do since we are in these conditions, and how can we glorify you with our lives given our circumstances. So Lord, it's unto you we surrender ourselves today and ask you, Holy Spirit, to protect us against the distractions and the deceptions of the enemy. We ask you to help us to hear you clearly and to understand your truth. We also pray, Lord, that you would write on the tablets of our hearts and our minds your truth, that we would be the vessels of your word, and that we would go forth in our lives faithful to you and being your ambassadors of your gospel, your mercy, your grace, but also your lordship over all of your creation. Help us, Lord, for without you we can do nothing. We love you, thank you, and praise you, and pray this in Jesus' name. Let's begin this morning by reading from Daniel, chapters 4 and 5. As a matter of context, we need to understand that chapters 4 and 5 are not only sequential in themselves, but they take place after chapters 1, 2, and 3, not just because that's where they're written in the Bible, but they actually do take place chronologically post the events of chapters 1, 2, and 3. That being said, Daniel chapter 4, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs, and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house, and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid. and the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen in its interpretation. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of the earth, of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. And he cried aloud and said thus, Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. In the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence of the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare its interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. But you are able, for the spirit of the holy God is in you. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let this dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you, after you come to know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride, he is able to put down. Chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. I have heard of you, that you give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Thus Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him its interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom of majesty, glory, and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished he executed, whomever he wished he kept alive, whomever he wished he set up, and whomever he wished he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whom he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command that they clothed Daniel with the purple and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. It's a very interesting part of the book of Daniel in the contrast that's being made here and the conflict that's being brought to light. I asked you a question that I've written on the board. Which is the greater challenge to faithfulness? Adversity or prosperity? Sometimes we think that stories like this might answer the entirety of this question. Stories like this are good at exposing certain conditions, but they're not altogether capable of answering such questions. And sometimes these kinds of questions are loaded. And it's very important that you, before you answer such questions, you think about the question carefully, because the options that are in front of you, neither one may be the answer. And so it's not a matter of a choice just between the two options you are given, but you may need to introduce the truth. In this story, we have the person representing adversity in Daniel. And in this story, we have all of the rest of the characters representing prosperity, other than the watchers. They are part of the characters of the story, but they're not of the dimension of man. So they're not part of these characters I'm referring to. But when you think about the characters in the story, you have Nebuchadnezzar and all of his court and all of the people who are serving in Babylon. And then you have his heir, his son, Belshazzar, who in chapter 5 is announced as the king. We're not given the period of time between chapter 4 and chapter 5, but it's clearly a sequence of events where Nebuchadnezzar has now died and his son is ruling in his place. His mother still being alive. She's the queen in the story of chapter 5. And what you find is this is a time of great prosperity in Babylon. The story makes this very clear. By the description of the tree, it is a very, very successful kingdom on earth. And at the time, it was a very, very great kingdom. When we look at the story, we can misunderstand some components of the story that may make us think, if we were to just take this part out of the book of Daniel and set it on its own, we may be misled by some of the elements that are in the story. So let me ask you a question. If you were someone, and you should be, who knows what the Lord has revealed to us in Daniel's chapters 1, 2, and 3, ask yourself this question. Why would Nebuchadnezzar, if he had a dream, call the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers once again?
His memory faded.
So we say in jest that his memory faded, but really this is the problem that can be brought on by prosperity. You see, somebody who is particularly prosperous and has another particular attribute can in fact act much similar to what Nebuchadnezzar is acting like. Despite the fact that God has demonstrated to Nebuchadnezzar his presence, his power, and his omniscience, infinite knowledge, despite the fact that God has made this very clear to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar has refused to let go of the paradigm of life that he has held on to for so long. All he's tried to do now is add this Most High God into the existing paradigm rather than seeing the conflict between the Most High God and the paradigm that he holds.
Tried to compartmentalize his life so that he could add in this other God who apparently is really good at interpreting dreams and protecting you from fire.
Yeah.
That's what he did.
He just thought it was another God to be added. How do we know this? If you pay careful attention in Nebuchadnezzar's own words in chapter 4. Now remember, chapter 4 is written after the events all take place, and he's been restored. And how does he speak about those events and his own personal condition? Well, one of the things he says in verse 8, he says, "But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar." How did Daniel get the name Belteshazzar? Well, according to the name of my God. He's telling us in his own recounting of this all, he has not cast off this false god that he's been worshiping for so long. Because Daniel still possesses the name of a God that he attends to, which is why he continues to call him Belteshazzar. Had he repented of this worship of false gods, Daniel would no longer be called Belteshazzar. It's very important to understand such things. And so I've actually heard some teachings say, I look forward to seeing Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. I don't think he's going to be there. I don't think he has a chance. Unless something happened that the story doesn't cover, if this is all we have, then there's no way for us to have any reason to think we're going to see him there.
Even if at the end of chapter 4, he seems completely humble before the Lord.
See, that's the trap people fall into. You're right, Howard. So if you look at the chronology of the end of chapter 4 comes after the beginning of chapter 4, and he says at the end, the King of heaven all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. That's all being said at the same time in the same announcement that he says, Daniel is called Belteshazzar after my God. You see, yes, of course he is. He's talking about, he's trying to be forked tongue and get people to accept all of these multitude of things that he's blending into a basket and being okay with the mixing and mingling that's been going on all the way back since Nimrod. It's exactly right. So,
Well, of a God.
hang on a minute, hang on. So you're right. He is mixing and mingling all this stuff together. But whether he thinks he has to rely upon Daniel is not the same thing as he ran out of all of his other resources and called Daniel as a last resort. You see, because what it reveals is he didn't start going to Daniel from the beginning. He used the same old tactics of going to the soothsayers, magicians, and astrologers that worship all these false gods to ask and inquire. And when they came up bankrupt, then he contacts Daniel.
If you really believe this guy over here, the Most High God speaks to him and tells him all the secrets, that's going to be my closest advisor. He's always going to be there. Anytime I make a decision, I'm going to ask him and go, okay, that's the truth then, and I'm going to use that. That guy would be there all the time.
Yeah, in a rational sense, a logical sense, somebody who has acted in Nebuchadnezzar's life the way Daniel has should have been his first call in the future, not his last call. But in this case, it's clearly evident by Nebuchadnezzar's own words that Daniel was still his last call. You think that's because Daniel brings bad news? Yeah, and so RJ says he thinks that this is because Nebuchadnezzar might conclude that Daniel brings bad news. Possible. Or LJ says maybe even news he doesn't want to hear. And sometimes people don't want to hear the truth, right? But I would submit to you that I think that Nebuchadnezzar has the same disease that many people have. They think they're above the truth. You see, they think the truth is relative. And once they find out what the truth is, all they have to do is do something and they can change the truth. You see, that was the story of Nebuchadnezzar building his statue. The truth came to him, and Nebuchadnezzar thought he was above the truth. Why? Well, because he builds the statue of gold as a way of telling God, no, you don't. I'm not going to let you. You see, that's not an uncommon practice, especially by those who have a level of prosperity they are comfortable with. You see, prosperity is a variable in people's lives. If you come from nothing, being just above the poverty level is prosperity to you. If you come from just above just left my head. If you come from just above the poverty level, then it's the next level that is prosperity to you. So low-income people are prosperous when they become middle-income people. Middle-income people are prosperous when they become higher income. You follow? And so what do we hear so many people talk about? How they want to be more prosperous than how they grew up. The only people who don't say this are people who come from incredibly wealthy backgrounds. And still they have a drive, and it may not just be for more money, but it's certainly for more recognition or success in some way. After doing this for over 20 years, I will tell you that this condition that Nebuchadnezzar has is by far more common than you would think among normal people, what we call normal people. As I have ministered to and advised and counseled and shepherded many people, the percentage of people that hold fast to their paradigm and try to just add the counsel that I've given to them is well over 90%. The vast majority of our population acts just like Nebuchadnezzar's acting here. And we fall for it because of these great pontificating words that are said by somebody like Nebuchadnezzar. I say we very loosely. I know I have to be included in the pronoun we, but I can tell you I fall for it less and less all the time because of the experience that I do have. The most common thing that happens when somebody asks me after I've had a counseling session with somebody, or it may be conflict and it may be lacking in conflict, and I'm asked, how did it go? I have one answer all the time. We'll see. Because I've heard so many stories, everything from how great and wonderful the counsel was to get out of my life and I never want to see you again. And I've had the opposite end up taking place. I've had the people tell me how wonderful and smart I am, go out and do the exact opposite of what I've told them. Or they try it for a few minutes and then abandon it because they're more interested in whether or not it's a magic formula rather than whether it's the will of God. And I've had people who tell me to go pound sand, God work in their lives to bring them to the end of themselves, for now they come back and say, I need your help. No different than Nebuchadnezzar here. We have lots of people who have, and everyone does, an existing paradigm, an existing set of thoughts that you have built over time based upon the input into your life. And when God confronts you, what he is intending to do is expose that paradigm, rip the roof off and shine all the light on it that he can. And the purpose of that is so that you can determine that part of your paradigm that is contrary to the truth of God, and you and I have to get rid of that part of our paradigm and not continue to allow it to mix and mingle in our thoughts and our lives. And if we don't, the law of leaven always is true. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. You see, we can't hold on to some of those paradigms that are in enmity with God and hope that we can be okay with God. That's what Nebuchadnezzar's doing. He's trying to hold on to all the stuff he arrived with before Daniel and God had confronted him, before Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego had confronted him. And he's just trying to now mix that all together and call it good. That by far is the most common practice of people I have dealt with over 20 years.
One of the interesting things, just looking back over what we've read so far in Daniel. So we have Nebuchadnezzar just admitting that he named Daniel after his God.
Yeah.
Right? We know that he didn't meet Daniel until Daniel was brought before him when he had had his oracle dream. So in other words, if he is the one who named Daniel, then he did so after Daniel had interpreted his initial dream. And he decided to name him after his own God as a way to mix Daniel's God with his own.
No, chapter 1, verse 7.
Chapter 1, verse 7 says, the chief of the eunuchs gave them those names.
Oh, okay.
Why did the chief of the eunuchs give him those names? Because the king said, this is how we do things here, right? And the chief of the eunuchs is going to do exactly what the king commands him. So in essence, you're exactly correct, but maybe not after he was brought before him, but clearly this is an edict of the king. This is how you're going to name these guys. You follow? And so it's as if the king does meet them and name them. He just hadn't met them yet. But the point is, this is all about, we look at King Nebuchadnezzar and we read these stories and we go, good golly, how does he not get it? There's these guys that were thrown in the fire and they live and God proves to them that he is God and Nebuchadnezzar better pay attention. Daniel comes in and interprets the dream that nobody else can interpret, and Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges, wow, the Most High God, he's awesome. And what happens? He goes back to his old ways. Why? Because he was unwilling to rid himself of the parts of his paradigm that were toxic to his relationship with God. He thought he could mix in a relationship with God with all that toxicity and he'd be okay.
Is that out of greed or pride? Yeah.
Pride is the ultimate answer. You're right, Taylor. Ultimately, it's out of pride. You see, that's why when I said earlier, people think that they can change the truth. They think they can decide to say God is not going to get away with this. Or I don't believe it. I don't trust God. I don't believe God. I don't believe in God. Of course, in his mind, because your question is, was he deciding not to make his other false gods angry? Yes. You see, in a man's condition like Nebuchadnezzar, who thinks all of this is plausible, he's going to play all ends to try to keep all things happy. I mean, my golly, what do we not have this in our existing country and around the world now with leaders who lead our country and other parts of the world? I mean, it is, especially when you're voted into your office by a popular vote. Good golly, what are you going to try to do but try to say things to please everybody, even if it's harmful to them? Because if their lust of their flesh is such that this is what they want, the only way they're going to support you is if you give them what they want. Nebuchadnezzar here is trying to make all of these different kingdoms that he, as the kingdom of Babylon, have conquered, happy with him. Because after you conquer a nation, you now have people. If you slaughter them all, you've got nothing. Okay, so you got to keep them alive. And then you need to make them happy with you. Otherwise, you're constantly fighting. And that's never the kind of kingdom that any of these kings want. So now they've got to figure out how to relate to them in a way that they can cooperate together. It's the cornerstone of his authority, ultimately, right? Is to get a buy-in from all the places he conquered, and now to make them realize you're better off serving me than you were serving that old king I just conquered. That's right. That's exactly right. And that's one of the things, your God liked me better, statements that goes on constantly at this time of the world. Very common. And so what do? They add that God to the one they're going to worship now. Why? So those people will be happy. You see, changing their mind to come to them and say, you didn't have a real God? Our God's the real God? Didn't go over with these cultures very well as a majority of the people. It may have gone over with a minority of the people, but the majority of the people weren't going to buy that. So it's too ingrained in their culture. These people were unwilling to give up that paradigm in their life. And so therefore, what did these kings learn to do well? Acclimate together and blend them. Very common practice. Nebuchadnezzar's doing it to a T here. The challenge, however, is how are we going to learn from the lesson? So we sit here and read about Nebuchadnezzar and the things that happened to him, and oh, that's cute. He went crazy for 7 years, and then God restored him. Isn't that a cute story? Question is, what are we going to learn? How are we going to know God any better through this story? And how are we going to learn to be those who will be more faithful and glorify God from this story? And not repeat being Nebuchadnezzar's ourselves.